Business, a podcast for all those subjects we've been trained to avoid. Here's your respectfully irreverent host, Keith Shelton.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I want to thank all of our nobodies out there who jumped to our help when we asked you to. So glad y'all did. We are able to stream live. We did get enough followers. Thank you for responding to our appeal, and we're so thankful you did. And hopefully you're going to see that it was worth it because of who we have for a guest tonight. But right now, I want to bring on my sidekick and co-pilot, JT Shelton, my son.
Hey, man, glad to be back. See, you got the link I sent you this time.
I did. I'm good at a lot of things, but my favorite saying is technology is great and wonderful until it's not great and wonderful. So no, I am not an expert at it, and I need a lot of help. So anyway, I just want to let y'all know we have a special guest tonight. We've already made it pretty clear what our topic is, and this will be of interest to our Lubbock nobodies. Joe Cruz graduated from Texas Tech University in 1987. He has a bachelor's degree in architecture. From his childhood, like me, he has had an interest in history, evolution, archaeology, anthropology, among other subjects. Yeah, just like me. I'm like Joe. I was interested in everything. He was introduced to creation science through a video series in college. After that, his interest in understanding these topics from a biblical viewpoint took on a whole new level of interest. The reason for today's show, welcome, Joe Cruz.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for the invite, Keith and JT. Appreciate it.
Well, we're glad to have you, Joe. Joe, to kick us off, tell us your story. How'd you get here?
Okay, well, hey, JT, have you got that photo called yearbook? Pull that up right there. So I'd like the audience to see that photo. Growing up, my family had a set of encyclopedias and yearbooks, and I discovered this somewhere around the 5th grade. I tell people this is my high school photo. This is from a page from my yearbook. I said, guess which one is me? You can kind of look and figure that out, You can also figure out probably who's the head of the chess club or something like that. The jocks in the middle, me on the left, and then the brainiac on the right. But so what this was it just totally captivated. It was what man used to look like in the past, Zinjanthropus up through Cro-Magnon, and then what we're going to look like in the future. And that just captivated my interest, 10 years old, whatever. And so I just kept interest in it. Now it's interesting, if you look at that photo, Zinjanthropus, they made these people try to look as human as possible. He's totally been removed from our lineage. If you look at the two on the bottom and the middle, Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, those are considered fully human. Peking and Java man are basically frauds and hoaxes and disappearances and stuff. So all that is neither here nor there, but I had never heard a sermon on creation growing up in church, and so I just became an evolutionist. I was a theistic evolutionist. I didn't even know what the term meant, but in high school I was taking anthropology, and I said, well, if evolution occurred, God directed the process, so I'm okay with that. It really doesn't matter. And so my teacher called it Joe's theory. Well, it's not Joe's theory. I didn't know there was such a thing as theistic evolution at the time. I learned later on. But I spent a year at Baylor University, and I had an Old Testament professor, great guy, super guy, William Pitts, and he was saying a lot of things in class that kind of confused me and that I hadn't heard before. So I went to his office one day. I said, hey, can I sit down and visit? He said, sure. So we sat down, and basically the bottom line, what he told me was that as man evolved, his concept of God evolved along with him, and then that's why the Bible contradicts itself. And I'm like, what? I wasn't aware the Bible contradicted itself, so we had some more discussion on that. I also went to a Sunday school class at 7th and James there that was taught by Gerald McCracken. Gerald was a great guy. He started what became Word Records. He had a really, I think, great broadcast career. He'd done a lot of great work, had some humorous things as well. But he had a master's in religion from Baylor. And when I went to his class, people warned me. They said, Gerald, his class is a little bit unusual. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm fine with that. And so, but Gerald was at a point in his life, and I'm not saying he's not saved, not in heaven or whatever, but I'm going to tell you his theology. And I think it came from getting his, master's in religion. He no longer believed that Jesus was divine. He didn't believe in miracles. He said Jesus was simply a guy that used more than 10% of his brain. He didn't believe in the virgin birth. And we went through all these things. And the authority of God's word had seemed to be obliterated in his life. Later that year, or at the end of that year, I switched my major to architecture. So I ended up in Lubbock. And when I was in Lubbock, I went to a Ron Carlson film series, and one night was on creation, and it was an apologetic seminar. And it just captivated my interest to see that, okay, my interest in these things of evolution and anthropology and history and archaeology can look at it from a biblical perspective. It was just fantastic. And so the architecture program, there's 5 year for the bachelor. It's not a master's 5 year, but so your 5th year, you do a thesis. And I ended up doing a creationist museum for my thesis because there really weren't any at the time. And it was tremendous. I basically dropped all my other classes. I'd been in college 10 years, had plenty of hours. So I just, basically took a year and studied this. And I was trying to express the principles of creation in the design. And, how can you look at something and know it was designed versus, it evolved or happened on its own. And so then I ended up expressing what was the initial moment of creation. It was kind of a cool deal, a lot of fun. And but through that process, I was challenged by my professors, especially one of the dean, who was doing my programming class, didn't want to grade my worldview because he pretty much thought it was fiction. And he told me that he's not sure there was a God, but if there was a God, he was God. And I was really the only person in the class that seemed to have an issue with that. So it was an interesting time. The guy that followed after that, super guy. I love these guys. They're, I'm not trying to say we had controversy because it was fairly good natured. But when I would go to my class, I'd have a stack of books, and he'd say, I see you brought your little books with you and everything. But then at the end, after I presented, I mean, they were blown away because they don't read this kind of evidence because they assume if you do, you're a nut job. You're some kind of knuckle dragging, anti-scientific backwater redneck that's, never graduated elementary school or something. So when he had to read it to grade it, it made a huge difference. So, but this brings me back to, I had a pastor one time that he said, the Bible doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. And that kind of blew me away at first. And as I studied this time for my thesis, and then since then, I realized that's really true. The Bible has figures of speech, just like we do. Bullinger had a book called The Figures of Speech in the Bible, like 217 that he identified. But a lot of times when talking about issues of creation, evolution, biblical veracity, people always kind of bring up passages like I think Psalm 19, where the sun, God's prepared a place for the sun like a tent, and he makes a circuit across the sky. And does the Bible really mean to say that the Bible, that sun ends up in a tent every night? Just ridiculers, and it doesn't. And R.C. Sproul said one time, he said, the Bible also uses the language of appearance. And he mentioned like the weatherman, for instance. The weatherman has more technology at his fingertips probably than anybody, in the news business. And yet, as we're approaching the summer solstice, the newsman may say, or the weatherman may say, sunrise at, 5:15, sunset at, 7:35 or something. And he's using the language of appearance as well. So the Bible does that. It uses similes, metaphors, but it also, and this is important, it also uses narratives, which are actual, factual, historical stories. And what you find is in the book of Genesis, it's a narrative. And so does the Bible mean what it means? And that's really where the controversy started to come in. There was a guy, his name was Stephen Boyd, and he said, the issue is not how we can read Genesis, but how should we read Genesis? And if the Bible means what it means, we need to figure out what the Bible is saying and go with that meaning. And if it's an actual narrative, then that's what we need to do. And what I began to discover over this time is that all of these alternate theories that we're trying to build in billions of years literally into the Genesis record, they were doing so primarily, believe it or not, to allow time for evolution. In the late 1700s, it was, I believe it was Hutton who published a book on uniformitarianism. This movement to make the think of the earth as an older construct than the Bible indicated had been coming on for a while, but he had a theory called uniformitarianism, meaning the present is the key to the past. Whatever's going on today is what's responsible for all the features you see.
The belief that geological forces at work in the present day, barely noticeable to our human eye, yet immense in their impact, are the same as those that operated in the past.
Right. And then Charles Lyell took that. Charles Lyell was a good friend of Darwin, and he was wanting to reduce the authority of the church in the culture and the countries in Western society. And so he said, well, how do we do that? Well, the Bible is the authority. We've got to undermine the Bible. Well, how do we undermine the Bible? Well, we need to go to Genesis, which is the foundation of the Bible. And maybe a future program we'll talk about the incredible revelations and scientific knowledge and theology. I mean, the book is just, it's revelation really is what it is. But he said, so if we're going to go after Genesis, what do? We got to go after the creation story. Well, what's this seminal idea of the creation story? Well, creation and days, 6 days, 6 literal days plus a day of rest. So it really, uniformitarianism fit in well with his idea that I'm going to take down the Bible, reduce the church's authority and all. So that was really a lot of the motivation. There was a guy, John Klotz, and I found this quote from him. He said, "It's hardly conceivable that anyone would question the interpretation of these as ordinary days were it not for the fact that people are attempting to reconcile Genesis and evolution." That's what was going on with this. Almost every commentary, there were a few that were, but almost every commentary prior to 1840 looked at Genesis as a 6 literal day creation. Now, Darwin published in 1859, so it was kind of in the midst of all this that he really gave a lot of impetus to people to let's move forward with this. But
Darwin.
Origin of Species.
He used the principles of geology. He found the time he needed for his theory of evolution to work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what he needed. So him and Lyell were buddies because of that, because if evolution occurred, it's going to take a long time and it's not going to happen in 6 days. And I found this interesting too, because I had so many people, and when we talk about Genesis, we'll talk about the meaning of the word day and how we know what it means in the context and all. But in a letter, a professor at Harvard, David Watson, he said this: "Probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament or at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that A, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the 24-hour days we now experience. B, the figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provided by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world up to the later stages of biblical history. C, Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and extinguished all human and animal life except for those in the ark. Or to put it negatively, the apologetic arguments which suppose the days of creation to be long eras of time, the figures of years not to be chronological, and the flood to be a merely local Mesopotamian flood are not taken seriously by any such professors as far as I know. The impetus, the motivation, does the Bible mean what it means? So if the Bible means what it means, it should be internally consistent. And there should be evidence outside the Bible as well that shows that is true. So is the Bible internally consistent? Well, let's look at that. If you look at the genealogies, you see that the earth, you can calculate by adding up the numbers of the genealogies, is around 6,000 years old. You have 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham, 2,000 from Abraham to Christ, and there's been about 2,000 years since then. So, roughly in that neighborhood of 6,000 years. And the clear intent of the passage, as I just quoted to you for some Hebrew scholars and others, and there's others that don't subscribe to Christianity at all that are also scholars, and they'll tell you the same thing, that the intent was a literal 6 days. And we see the consistency there because at each time he's saying there's evening and there's morning, which again is why the Hebrew day begins at sundown, because Genesis says evening and morning, each day. And
it was evening. It was evening, and then it was morning.
Right. You start the day with rest. In other words, kind of a cool concept. So the 10 Commandments talk about the 6-day creation. 4 and 6 days God made the heavens and earth. And the words of Christ himself talk about 6 days. He said, have you never read, he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? Well, that's a pretty good issue for us today when we can't figure out who's a man and who's a woman. But Christ himself, he said at the beginning. What beginning is he talking about? In the beginning. Okay. God created Adam and Eve in the beginning. Now we'll get into this more later, but to give you a piece of revelation, a flavor for what might come down the road, John MacArthur said one time, and I forget the scientist he quoted, but he said everything that exists is either time, force, action, space, or matter. Okay. First verse, first chapter, first book of the Bible. In the beginning, that's God. Excuse me. In the beginning, that's time. God, that's force. Created, that's action. The heavens, that's space. The earth, that's matter. Time, force, action, space, matter, and the opening of the Bible. So those are the kind of things you're going to discover as we look further at the book of Genesis. Now, to be theologically consistent also, and I'll get off this pretty soon, is you look at Romans 5:12. How did death enter the world? It entered through sin. So if you've got millions upon millions of years of death prior to sin, then sin didn't cause death. So then why did Jesus Christ have to die for our sins? He didn't. And so we have supposedly all these millions of years of, God testing out, different proto men, whatever. I remember listening to Louis Leakey one time at Texas Tech, and he went to the Anglican Archbishop of the Anglican Church and said, "Do you have a problem with what I'm doing with evolution?" He said, No, I have no problem at all. I think you're just looking for, Adam's ancestors and all. So, but it's very, very, very different. So all of these other interpretations of Genesis, whether we're talking the gap theory, which you've probably heard of, the day age theory, the framework hypothesis, progressive creation, there's a whole bunch of these flavors. Well, every single one of them is trying to read long ages into the text of Genesis in really clear violation of, I think, what the text is saying. But once you do that, you start having to make compromises in other locations of the Bible. And, they have justifications for that, which they feel are good justifications. I'm not so convinced. For instance, we'll talk about the global flood at some point in this. Well, there's hardly anything more clear than the fact that there was a global deluge. Genesis 7 records it. And so many times God talks about all life, the animals. He destroyed the ground. So when man sinned, the ground was cursed. So God sent a local flood. It makes no sense. And you go back through, the New Testament confirms that it was a global flood. So you haven't start playing games. And the reason why is because they believe that this geologic column with fossils in it happened prior to the advent of Genesis. And so if you have this gigantic breaking apart of the earth, all the fountains of the great deep breaking forth, possibly meteoric impact with the windows of heaven open, this cataclysmic event, which creationists also think may have led to the actual spreading of the continents, which we can talk about, the breakup of Pangea, which some of them believe happened at meters per second rather than centimeters per century. I mean, there's some fascinating studies going on. It would have destroyed all of this evidence for a supposedly old Earth, this geologic column. So they have to postulate a local flood, which, again, I think is pretty well not in line with what the scripture teaches.
Well, Joe, that doesn't even take into account the fact that every culture around the world, from Polynesia, Asia,
Right.
North America, South America, they all have roughly the same outline of the flood, which is quite consistent, with Genesis 7, and would make sense if you study Genesis 9, Tower of Babel instance, and God, through the confusion of languages, forced man. I mean, he gave him two opportunities. He kept saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but they wouldn't do it. So what happened when, with the Tower of Babel incident? Tower of Babel was the second major time that they were disobedient. And he said, look, I've had enough. You are going to disperse and you are going to fill the earth. And so when he confused the languages, there they go. But they were right there on the heels of the Noah event. They were right there on the heels of the flood event. So why would it be a surprise to anybody that a global flood with a small remnant being saved wouldn't be found all over the globe?
Yeah.
Well,
and interesting. Henry Morris talks about that when there's the table of nations, there's 70 families, which is, I think, why in the New Testament Christ sent out 70. That's another story. But he's the 70 nations. I think, and Morris, I believe, is right. He said that God, when he confused the languages, he did, one per tribe, one per family tree, if you will. And if you look at it doesn't take very long to create a different race, if you will. If you take your tribe, your family, and you go off and you stop, interbreeding with any other tribe, you can create. I mean, I've noticed I can pick out. We have a lot of Amish people around here, and I can pick them out pretty quickly. But what's fascinating is prior to the Cultural Revolution in communist China, which Mao conducted in the 50s. Missionaries were using the Chinese alphabet to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ because so many of the Chinese characters were graphic references to Genesis. Whether it's a flood being 8 people in a boat, a man in a garden looking toward the east. And so the missionaries were having success, so they had to get rid of it.
Joe, there's a great video of a Chinese preacher using ancient Chinese alphabet, and he did that very thing. He went through the history of the world using the Chinese alphabet, the ship with the sail. I mean, oh my gosh, that was such a fascinating video to watch. Was that guy? He was up on a whiteboard, and he would take all those ancient characters in the Chinese alphabet, and he showed how those characters were literally taken out of the creation and flood narrative. It was amazing. Yeah. It was absolutely amazing.
It's fascinating.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And over the years, as I've talked to people, and I've not done a scientific survey, but I've heard of surveys that have done this. Most people I've met who don't believe in God, there's been 2 primary reasons. One, they've had a horrible tragedy, a brother, a spouse, a child, had a tragic accident, a disease, lost their life. It's horrible. Okay. or maybe a relationship broke up and God didn't answer the prayer. And so, there's this massive heartache and disappointment. But the other one is, and this is the one that most people tell me, is that there's just too much evidence for evolution and they can't believe in God for that. I mean, we could have a whole program on that. So many times I've been told that. Well, here's the deal. And this is where I think the enemy of our faith is very deceptive. If the earth is young, relatively young, and let's say 6 to 10,000 years, okay, there's no time for evolution. I mean, it becomes completely irrational to try to say all of this would have evolved. What has happened is the more we've learned about the complexity of living systems, they've pushed back the time frame because it's so complex. How could it happen? The problem is, for their side, is that the further you go back, the larger the genetic burden becomes that we know is being passed on with mutations each generation. And so it creates a whole host of issues. But so the other thing is that it's really not the evidence, I think, that bothers most people when I really get down to it. It's the implications of the evidence. If there is a God who created the physical laws of the universe, it stands to reason he created the moral law as well. And that's where, C.S. Lewis talks about, you look around the world and, you don't find people that are admired for running away in battle and other types of things, even though people may not, he said, agree whether you should drive on the left or the right, or have one wife or four. They pretty much agree you shouldn't drive just wherever you want and have any woman you want. Now, our modern culture is probably getting so messed up that may not be true anymore. But the point I thought was well made. But see, if God does not exist, mankind's highest pursuits are power and pleasure. And man, you see that. I mean, we could talk about different dictators throughout history. Power and pleasure, that's what they're about. And so again, that's a whole nother program on the impact. But if the other side has evidence, what do they point to as being the primary evidence that the earth is old? And there's basically three. There's several they'll bring up, but there's three. One is the radiometric dating methods, radioactive materials and their decay rates. The other is the geologic record. We have erosion, we have deposition that we can measure, we have the fossil record within the geologic column, and then the third one is a starlight and time in the vastness of the universe that we have. So as long as evolution is considered possible because of the time frame, a lot of people are going to subscribe to that. I want to read one more quote from George Wald. He was a professor of biology at Harvard. He wrote this back in 1954, of all things. He said, the important point is that since the origin of life belongs in the category of at least once phenomena, time is on its side. However improbable we regard this event, or any of the steps which it involves, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once. In life, and of life as we know it, with its capacity for growth and reproduction, one time may be enough. Time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. The time which we have had to deal with is on the order of 2 billion years. What we regard as impossible on the basis of human experiment is meaningless here. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. That's why the issue of this time, the issue of Genesis, does it mean what it means, is so incredibly important. Time is considered a miracle worker. So let's take a closer look at some of the evidence that they give. And what I find also fascinating is that carbon-14 is a very common, and I wanted to talk about carbon-14 first. All radiometric dating has a radioactive parent material, which as it gives off electrons and decays, becomes what they call the daughter material. So it's the parent to the daughter. And for instance, carbon-14 goes to, carbon-14 to nitrogen-14. You got potassium to argon. You got rubidium to strontium, uranium, lead. There's different methods, but they're all based on similar assumptions, and that being that how much parent material is there, and then how much daughter material, and then you can measure that accurately. So you're making some assumptions about that. You're going to ask or assume that there is a constant decay rate, and that this decay rate is not affected by outside environmental factors. And has there been anything to contaminate these samples in the meantime? And so the reason I want to look at C14 is I think they're all a friend to creationism. They're on our side is where I think people may be surprised by that. But if you look at C14, cosmic rays collide in the atmosphere with nitrogen-14, and as a result, they create carbon-14, which is the radioactive version. Now, there's like carbon-12 is the regular carbon, and there's like 1 trillion carbon-12 atoms to every single carbon-14 atom. So it's a pretty significant ratio. But over time, the carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen. So every 5,730 years, half of the carbon-14 is decayed. It's called a half-life. Your audience probably knows what that is. But so every 5,730 years, it loses half of its radioactivity. So,
and then another 5,700 years, that other half loses half.
Exactly.
And so on. Okay.
Exactly. And so what that means is that the maximum age, if you're going to carbon date anything, okay, and all living things absorb carbon-14 until they die, and then they stop absorbing it. So if you're going to measure, an animal fossil, a human, a plant, whatever, and you're going to measure it, the maximum range to be able to date because of that half-life is 50,000 to maybe 100,000 years. Okay, that's the time frame. So at that point, just say beyond 100,000, you're not going to be able to measure any C14 at that point. Okay, now why is that important?
Joe, I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah,
I understand perfectly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
That makes one of us, Joe. I said that makes one of us.
Oh, okay.
How would an evolutionist explain that there have now been discovered and documented by secular scientists dinosaur fossils that contain carbon-14 when dinosaurs were supposed to have died out 65 million years ago?
That's where all this is going, actually. And see, we're finding carbon-14 all over the place in fossils that are supposedly up to 200 million years old. Okay, we're finding carbon-14 in oil. I've read stories where they say they don't find carbon-14 in diamonds. Actually, they do find carbon-14 in diamonds, and diamonds are considered some of the hardest surfaces on the planet, and so contamination is very, very, very unlikely. And the fact is that the carbon-14 would have been gone because these things are dated like 900 million to 3.4 billion years old. Well, dinosaurs supposedly, died off 70 million, and you've got a maximum theoretical limit of around 100,000 years, and we're finding carbon-14 in all these.
I've studied up on carbon-14, and you can't even. There's no detectable trace amount that would be found in something that was 100,000 years old. It's not even enough to have detected. So when you find carbon-14 in things that are supposedly so old, these millions and millions and millions of years old, it just tells you it couldn't have happened. But it's there. And I didn't document it, and you didn't document it. These are some secular archaeologists that documented it.
That's right. That's right. And see, when you start talking about unmineralized dinosaur tissue, they're finding actual DNA, hemoglobin of vessels. And you're like,
intact, intact blood vessels.
Yeah, it's like, Jurassic Park all over. And so the theory was, well, how in the world? I mean, we're talking this stuff could only survive in the wild, if you say, in thousands of years. How would it go beyond that? And so they came up with a couple of ideas. One was that, well, if you take this material and put it at -5 degrees centigrade, you can extend the life maybe to 6 or 7 million years. But there's two problems with that. One is that dinosaurs lived in warm climates. Okay, and so the freezing is probably unlikely. But even if you went to 6 or 7 million, the dinosaurs supposedly went extinct at 65 to 70, and again they're up to 200 million. So you're still only 10% of the way there. So it remains a huge problem. Now, the other thing they came up with was, and I forget, Mary Wexler, whatever, I forget her name, that was one of the first ones to discover this. In 2005, she said that, well, because there's iron in hemoglobin, it's quite possible that the iron in the hemoglobin preserved whatever this soft tissue was, and the DNA included, and so therefore maybe that was a mechanism. But then there was another paper that came out in, I believe, 2017, which really put that to rest. So that didn't happen. That couldn't have happened. So this idea of soft tissue in dinosaur bones is huge. And you start wondering, have people even been looking for this? Because if you didn't expect to find it, were you looking? And I was on an archaeological dig in Glen Rose. I've been there a few times on that, and got to meet A.E. Wilder-Smith many years ago. If you've ever seen the film series Origins, he's on that video. And the director of the museum there was telling us that at one time we're supposedly digging through this Cretaceous, limestone, whatever, 70 million years old, whatever it was. And I wasn't there when it happened, but prior to that, one of the guys on the dig was an evolutionist, and he found a hair as they were uncovering some rock. And he reached over, and everybody goes, a hair, and he reaches over and drops in the Paluxy River and lets it wash away. Well, why is that important? Well, mammals have hairs. What is a long piece of hair doing at 70 supposedly million-year-old? But there's also additional problems with the C14 analysis, and this is totally fascinating. You talk about evidence for a young Earth. The magnetic field of the Earth is decaying. Its half-life is about 1,500 years, meaning that 1,500 years it was twice as strong as it is today. And you go back 3,000, it'd be 4 times as strong. And there's a lot of creation scientists that have looked at this and said, if you go back beyond about 10,000 years, life can't even exist on the planet. But here's the interesting thing about that. The stronger the magnetic field is, it tends to block more cosmic radiation. The weaker the magnetic field becomes, the more cosmic radiation that gets through, and so more C14 is produced in the atmosphere on the planet, the weaker the field is. So as you go further back in the fossil record or whatever, the further back you get, less was being produced. And so if less was being produced, even the ages they're dating have to be inflated. So it's incredible. And there's also issues also with possible decay rate variations and things like that. So this C14 that we've been led to believe is, and it probably is highly accurate sometimes in a very short period of time. But what you find, because of this magnetic decay rate, if you go back about say 400 BC is what I've heard and read, the historical artifacts don't really line up with the written records, because there's starting to be a lot of discrepancy back then. So if you're trying to date something 50, 60,000 years old, you're going to have a lot more of that distortion. And so these ages of, even if you're whatever age, it's probably inflated because of the fact that less C14 was being produced. But if you go back very far anyway, life couldn't exist on the planet. So it's I think God has left us reasonable evidences. He says, "Come, let us reason together." And I remember also when you remember the story of the paralytic who came and his friends let him down through the roof. The house was full and they couldn't get to Jesus. And Jesus looks at this guy and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And of course, the religious leaders, I mean, I would have been there. I would have been shocked too, man. Who does this guy think he is? God? I mean, only God can forgive sins. Who does he think he is? And of course, there was a few other times when they were going to stone Christ because he basically said, "I'm God." And they consider that blasphemy. Well, so then he looks at him, and he knows what they're thinking. And he goes, "Well, let me ask you this, guys. What's easier to say? Your sins are forgiven, or rise up and walk?" And obviously, it's a rhetorical question. Neither one is harder to say. Well, if you're sovereign and God is, everything obeys him. What's harder to say? Your sins are forgiven, rise up and walk, or let there be light? It doesn't matter. And we see, if you believe the Bible, I mean, there's a time when they're out on a boat in a storm and they think they're going to drown, and Christ gets in the boat. The next thing you know, they're right on the seashore. I mean, what did they travel? Instantaneously 5,000 miles an hour, just from 0 to 5,000 miles an hour, whatever it is, and then stop instantly and nobody is hurt. I mean, that's incredible. But when you're sovereign, you can do that. So there is so much that we can get into that. But
well, Joe, let me ask you this. I mean, can't we just agree that the evidence is what the evidence is? When I say evidence, I mean the physical evidence, the stories, the cultural, the fact that the universal flood exists in all the cultures around the world. The physical evidence, like you've been talking about, carbon-14, the fact that dinosaur tissue in fossils has been found, and it's soft tissue, which is not supposed to be found, and we can just go on and on and on. But can't we agree that it's really about what your worldview is?
Absolutely.
If you have a biblical worldview, you're going to look at that evidence, and the evidence isn't going to change. The evidence is what the evidence is. But then if you're looking at it from a secular worldview, you're going to come into your examination of the exact same evidence, and you're going to be as biased and you're going to be as prejudiced in the opposite direction. And so, if you don't have an open mind and can receive and simply let the evidence tell you what the evidence wants to tell you, then, for all the criticisms they will level, and believe it or not, and this is for our listeners and viewers, there are thousands and thousands of well-respected, renowned Christian scientists out there in the fields of archaeology, in the fields of geology, in the fields of anthropology. And they see the exact same evidence. And instead of, being so vociferous to attack, secular opinions, they simply say, here's what I see. And I see that it supports my biblical worldview. On the other hand, the secular scientists, they don't allow the evidence to speak for itself. They will view the evidence and then attack, their peers in the field who happen to be, God forbid that anybody lets it be known that they're a believer, they're a Christian in the field, because the talk about the evidence ends there. They're attacked personally. Yet you don't see those same kind of attacks in the other direction. And so, the evidence is what the evidence is, but it's what worldview are you bringing to the table when you walk up to the edge of that examining table, what are your preconceived notions? What are your what is your belief system? Are you doing everything you can to prove there is no God?
I'm someone who, I will admit, I've never heard the term C14 before today. So I've kind of been over here looking up stuff, researching some things, and I came across a Reddit thread about C14 and diamonds, and Reddit is a cesspool for a lot of non-believing groups. And one of the first things that someone said was, young Earth creationism is not just a denial of evolution; it's a denial of basic principles in physics and engineering. That instead of answering the guy's question on the thread, he's just attacking. He's just attacking creationism.
Exactly.
That happens to me all the time. Now, the best you can say about the theory of evolution is that it's an unsubstantiated hypothesis. That's the best thing you can say about it. If you say that, and I was just in a discussion the other day with a guy, they're going to call you every name in the book. Okay, they're not going to answer the question. And then finally, I tried to be very cordial. I mean, we're an ambassador for Christ. We don't need to call people names and stuff, though it's tempting sometimes. And I haven't always, I haven't always done well in that.
Don't get Keith started.
Yeah,
don't get me started.
I have a lot of failure in that regard. Just to be honest with you. But so I typed out this, tried to be as generous as I could, and then after he just goes, whatever. So after calling me, morons and things like that, suddenly I'm there. But before we left the topic, when we have a known quantity and we benchmark, we test the C14, the carbon-14 dating, we get interesting results. And this happens with all of the dating methods. For instance, a live clam had a C14 saying a test had been dead for 3,000 years. We had a 30-year-old sea carcass that said it had been dead for 4,600 years. You got fresh seal carcasses. C14 said they've been dead for 1,300 years. You get houses sunk in a peat bog in Denmark, of all places. Well, there were hazelnuts inside the house. I mean, obviously somebody wanted hazelnuts. Well, the C14 on the hazelnuts was 1,000 years older than the house itself. A live snail was 27,000 years. A hair of a mammoth was 26,000, but the soil that it was found in was only 5,600. But you need to know that the other dating methods, that the radiometric dating methods, have similar results. And I want to give you one that I find rather telling, of course. 1980, now JT, you may be too young to remember this, but Mount St. Helens blew its top in 1980. So 1990, a group of scientists went back and they went to the volcano cone on top, and they took a rock sample. So they had a potassium argon test run on that rock sample. Okay, they did several tests on it. Now, potassium, radioactive potassium decays to argon. Now, as long as that rock is not hard, that argon can bubble out of there. But once that rock hardens, the argon is stuck. Okay, guess what age range, because there was a range, the age of that rock, according to potassium argon, and this is not just material that was blown out deep of the earth. The clock starts when the rock is hardened and the argon can no longer dissipate from the rock. It's not like it was down on the earth. The clock starts when the argon stops diffusing out. The age range was 350,000 to 2.8 million, and it's a 10-year-old rock. Okay. Whoa, how accurate is that system? When you look at the Grand Canyon, I remember watching a video recently where they were talking about at the base of the Grand Canyon, you have these lava flows that went into some of the layers, and we'll talk a lot about the Grand Canyon. There's so much to learn from it. And then the rock is metamorphosized, due to heat pressure and all. And so when they would take those samples, every dating method gave a different answer. And the same dating method even gave different answers every time they tested it. And they said, if these were accurate, if you take, say, I'm going to measure my desk here. I've got a wooden ruler. I've got a metal ruler. I've got a plastic ruler. I've got a tape measure. I've got a metal tape measure. I've got a cloth tape measure. They should all measure the same, right? They don't. And they vary widely. And I remember reading years ago, and I think I shared this, Keith, at one of their seminars we did. And I forget, gosh, I need to look it up. But one of the methods when you were dating radiometric data in the Grand Canyon, the rocks at the top were the youngest, the ones at the bottom were the oldest. That's what you would think, right? Well, when you another method showed just the opposite of that. So, which one are you going to go with? Well, I think it's pretty clear. Lava rocks formed in 1801 Hawaii. 3 billion-year-old radiometric dating. If volcanic material is formed underwater, it gives an inflated age, and much of the material came from the fountains of the Great Deep in Genesis 7 there. 22 volcanic rocks from around the world formed less than 200 years ago, dated 100 million to 10 billion. Volcanic rock on Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean, dates vary from 100,000 to 4.4 billion. I mean, you just go on and on and on, and these are not isolated cases by any means, and so there's kind of a lot of selective reporting that goes on.
Well, Joe, that's what I want to get you to pause there. That's COVID-19. Late 2019, early 2020. What were we hearing? The science is settled. The science is settled.
Trust the science
is settled. Trust the science. Follow the science. Well, we know how that ended. We know how that turned out. Well, if you aren't living in a bubble, it's like every time you turn around and you read anything about the physical world, historical world, archaeology, it's such and such was discovered, and it has caused scientists to rethink X. It has caused scientists to rethink Y. It's constant. Well, what does that tell you? Never was settled to start with.
Yeah,
you agree?
Yeah, one of the hallmarks of science, when they say you can't question the science, that's not science. Science is always questioning itself. It has to be testable. It has to be repeatable. And so if Professor A does a scientific experiment, Professor B needs to be able to repeat that same experiment. Now, there's
exactly
whole reasons why I wouldn't, but for them to not even say you can't even question it, that's the very opposite of science. That's actually fascism at that point. And it was, we knew from the beginning masks would not stop the spread. We knew that natural immunity is superior. We knew that masks created increased carbon dioxide in your system, whatever that is, hypercapnia or hypoxia, which one it is. It decreases your oxygen. It increases your chance for lung infections. There were so many things. And everybody that brought that up was being deplatformed, losing their job.
Yes, yes.
And the social distancing was totally made up. That was a test run, I think, to see how far, if you scare people, you can manipulate them, okay? And I think the whole thing is to generate fear. And there is a time coming, believe it or not. I mean, the Bible talks about there's going to be a time coming that is so fearful that men's hearts will fail from fear. So they've got stuff planned. I don't know what it is, but I do know if you look at the Georgia Guidestones and others, they want to limit the population of the earth to 500 million. Well, that means 15 of every 16 of us need to go away. You got people like Bill Gates or population control freaks that are working on the viruses or on supposed vaccines. And you can probably find this clip on the web still, but
oh yeah,
I
know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, he was being interviewed, and the interview says, well, people didn't take it very seriously. He looks over at his wife. They were still married, I guess. She looks over, they grin, and they go, well, they will on the next one. And you're like, whoa, what are you talking about?
What next one?
Yeah.
Well, Joe, let's get back to the topic we're on, and that is, all I'm saying is the same thing. Every time you come up with evidence, and I'm talking about evidence to say there's no way evolution explains this. Well, what do the evolutionists do? They have to alter what they were claiming was the scientific principle. Well, what do we know about a scientific principle? It's got to be observable, and it's got to be repeatable. I mean, just watch this. I've got my phone. If I let go of it, what's going to happen? It's going to fall. How many times do I have to do that before you realize it's going to fall every time? Why? The law of gravity. It's one of the laws of gravity. Okay. Well, what happens when they've told you here's the reality, and then you prove it wrong. Well, what do? It's like the more you prove them wrong, it's like the more outrageous the explanations have to become, just so that they can hold on to that millions and millions and millions of years belief, because they are bound and determined to disprove the Bible. Is just like what you said, because if they have to acknowledge that the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is true and accurate, they've got to acknowledge there's a creator, and it wasn't them.
Yeah,
which means they may wake up one day and find out for all the things that they've been doing, they have to be accountable, and that's what they can't stomach.
Right. And Christopher Hitchens, brilliant guy. I love listening to his debates. Of course, he's an atheist, but brilliant guy. I think probably a nice guy. But Doug Wilson, who debated him and I guess was friends with him, said that he summed up Christopher Hitchens' philosophy as there is no God and I hate him, and that's that's pretty much what it
makes
was.
Perfect sense. Makes perfect sense.
There is no God. It's like, well, why would you be mad at Santa Claus? If you didn't believe in Santa Claus. But I know we're about ready out of time, so I'm gonna hit a couple of things, just high point. Moon rocks dated from 6,000 to 28 billion, but we chose the one that fits the evolutionary interpretation. When Richard Leakey found his 1470 man in Africa, the dates were from 290,000 to 220 million. So he picked 2.6 because that's where he thought his theory would.
Joe, I'm going to get you to pause there a second.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. People who haven't tried to dig into this stuff, people who haven't tried to dig into a lot of things about the Bible, about archaeology, about biblical archaeology, archaeology about the Bible that is extra biblical. In other words, things that are found in Mesopotamia, things that are found in Egypt, things that are found in North America, even that are consistent with the Bible. The point I was trying to make is it's when you dig into what they say, it's just like you said, it's almost like they were just completely arbitrary. They could have just as soon said, it kept flopping over to the right, when in fact, when you look at the evidence, it was 50-50. It would fall to the left, half the time, and it'd fall to the right. But for some reason, they said their observation was so-and-so, but the evidence wasn't there. I'm going to give you an example. Kathleen Kenyon, who came after two other archaeological digs of the city of Jericho. Well, the first two archaeological digs dated the fall of Jericho at exactly the right time for it to have been destroyed by the conquering Hebrew army. Well, Kathleen Kenyon was the right-hand archaeologist of the guy who led the second archaeological examination, okay? And then she continued after he died. She took over, and instead of agreeing with the first two, she, for a totally unexplained reason, said, oh no, Jericho fell at least 150 years before the Hebrews would have gotten there, were the Exodus story true. Okay. Well, number one, that shows a great bias. Number two, what happened between the second dig and her follow-up digs, guess what? The nation of Israel came into existence in 1948. Okay. When she was finally made her statement, well, guess what the media latched on to?
Sure.
Her. They totally disregarded the first two digs and latched on to her. Why? It's part of the culture war we're seeing. But do you know what her reason was? She could not find a particular type of pottery. It didn't matter that there was all kind of Canaanite pottery from the right time period in the right layers that were there. She was looking for a particular type pottery and didn't find it. So that particular pottery told her that, well, the city had to have fallen before that pottery came into existence. Well, here's something else you need to know about the archaeological digs of the city of Jericho. She did not examine all of the city of Jericho. Who knows if that pottery is there?
Right.
When you look at the areas examined by the first dig, you look at the areas examined by the second dig, and then you look at the areas she dug, they still haven't even examined 12 to 15% of all of ancient Jericho. But because she came to that conclusion and the media wanted to jump on what she said, well, that's all you've heard ever since, around 1950 something, is that there's no way that Jericho was conquered by the Hebrews who had been led out of Egypt. And I'm telling you, I mean, Bibles, commentary Bibles, study Bibles are published right today, where they will tell you that there's no archaeological evidence that Jericho fell at the hands of the conquering Hebrews. Those are Bibles, Joe.
Right.
Thompson Publishing.
Right.
Okay, that's an example I know of.
Well,
my point simply is,
Go ahead.
My point simply is, you hear it, and because you hear it, and supposedly, it's a news story. Well, you got to believe it. Well, guess what? No, you don't have to believe it. Right. If you are willing to do a little bit of your own digging, if you're willing to do a little bit of your own research. Just like I told you, I saw the video of that Chinese preacher who was preaching about out of the Old Testament. Obviously, he was leading the teaching up to Christ, but he was using ancient Chinese writing characters, and he was explaining how they came into existence and what the meaning of each of the strokes were. And it all made perfect sense. Well, how many of our listeners and viewers tonight even know that exists? Even know that it's there for anybody to see. Okay? If you're sitting comfortable in your home and all you're worried about is getting your kids to the soccer practice, or you're not going to know that. And so the easy thing is to just simply take whatever comes in on the TV or comes in on your little device here, and you're just flying on. But it's not true. It's not true. Now, Joe, we are running up on time. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I had the opportunity to eat lunch with some fine young men, and here's what I did. And I want your commentary when I get through telling you the story. I said, boys, I'm going to throw out a term to you. It's called irreducible complexity. I said, remember what that term is. I said, and here's what I'm going to tell you. I walk into a room and I'm holding a trolling motor. And I walk up to the edge of that table and I throw that trolling motor on that table and I say, gentlemen, I want you to understand something. That trolling motor is the result of millions and millions and millions of years of random acts. Would you believe me? I said, no. It had to be put together. It had to be designed. I said, okay. Well, now you understand the concept of irreducible complexity. There are certain things that if you take out, say, for example, the plastic housing off of that, the motor part, okay, unscrew the part that makes up the handle, okay, you still got a trolling motor. But the minute you take the propeller off, or you disconnect the wires to the motor, or take the motor, what have you done? You no longer have a trolling motor. You have a pile of junk, okay? And the concept is irreducible complexity. And they just, their eyes were like, number one, I've never heard the word. Number two, I've never had the concept explained to me. I said, so do we agree that if I were to throw that trolling motor up on that table and tell you that, what would you say? Well, you're lying. There's no way. It had to be designed. It had to be created. I said, okay. Don't ever forget the phrase irreducible complexity. And then I brought up this, Joe, the bombardier beetle.
Oh, yeah.
Now, here's, and we're going to do this quickly. The bombardier beetle has two chambers. And in one chamber, it has a chemical. And in the other chamber, it has a different chemical. And then it has a third chamber that when that bug is attacked, it can squeeze those two chemicals out of those first two chambers into the third chamber where the chemicals mix. And the chemical reaction is so explosive and so powerful, it becomes a liquid that has reached the boiling point of water, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. And it explodes out of that third chamber. Now, here's my question. How does evolution explain the creation of that first chamber? How does evolution explain the existence of that liquid that's in that first chamber?
Yeah. What
then
purpose
follow
would
up.
Right.
Do I?
Well, yeah. What purpose would it have if it didn't have the end purpose in mind already? So, I mean, it's
Well, and that was the irreducible complexity example I used with the boys. I then said, okay, every one of you got a phone, get on your phone and look up bombardier beetle. And I just sat there. And Joe, it was absolutely unbelievable. I said, okay, let me ask you something. Do you think that thing got here by millions and millions of years of random acts? Or do you think that was designed and created exactly what you see today? Joe?
What'd they say?
It was inescapable. I said, I'm sitting here. Explain to me how evolution can explain a bombardier beetle. They couldn't. I said, do you understand how complex that is? And that if you take any one thing away, that bug has lost its defense mechanism. And then I watched him looking at hey, y'all, look at this. This frog ate that thing. And man, that thing blew up in his mouth and that frog couldn't get him spit out fast enough. Well, that I didn't have to tell him anymore. They were sitting there talking to each other about it because they had just discovered something. Number one, nobody had ever told them about a bombardier beetle. Nobody had ever mentioned irreducible complexity. And so when they saw it actually being studied, in laboratories where it was literally fed to a frog, and watch the reaction, and to think that explosion. Here's the thing. Here's something. That third chamber is constructed so unbelievably well that explosion can occur there, and it's not damaged. It's tough enough to take that explosion. I love JT putting these memes up there.
And you know what else about that? It's not just one pop. If you record that and slow it down, it's like there's several explosions going off. So you got the pressure, all those multiple explosions going on, and it still doesn't damage.
Yet the bug is not harmed.
Right.
And 5 minutes later, that bug has completely reloaded. Now, Joe, that is in the coding of the DNA.
For something is a little bitty bug.
Yeah. How does evolution, that's based on the theory that, a bunch of mutations happen and most of them are bad, but when one good happens, well, that improves the organism. Well, like I said, you let one code out of that bug's DNA be not there, there are no more bombardier beetles because they're easily eatable. They become extinct because they're eaten up.
There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculation.
That's true. Well, see, all of these intermediate steps have to have a purpose and a function, and
Joe, let me say this. Well, let me say this. That was my next question. That was my next question to my boys sitting there. I said, where was the predecessor bug? Where's the missing link? Have you ever heard of it?
Well,
Got an example of it? Well,
there's billions of missing links.
well, that's just it. You know, that's the thing. The mystery is they had never heard of the bombardier beetle.
Yeah.
Then you got the same problem with explaining how a woodpecker became a woodpecker.
Bang
Okay. I mean, the examples are just endless of things that evolution has to adapt itself. Well, it comes to a point where the evolutionist is coming up with so many wild presuppositions and conjectures that to believe what they're saying requires way more faith than is required of me to believe my Bible.
Well, you know, when we talk about cosmos and all, I remember John MacArthur saying that as a Christian or a Bible believer, you believe in one miracle called God, and you can make sense of everything else. The atheist doesn't believe in God, and everything's a miracle. For instance, when we talk about the creation of time, space, matter continuum, science is now saying that at one time didn't exist. That that's hard for us to fathom, but time, space, and matter did not exist. So because there's a law of causality, everybody's heard, you know, every cause has an effect, every effect had a cause, no effect is greater than its cause. So whatever created the time, space, matter continuum had to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And that sounds an awful lot like God. And but the other side, they don't call them miracles because that's a 3-letter word that I guess rubes like us use. They use the word singularity, what is singular? So it's a 5-syllable word, which sounds very urbane and erudite. So they're full of singularities, violations of scientific laws and principles, but they're never going to call them miracles. It's called a singularity, like even the inflation of the universe that they propose. If all the matter in the entire universe is concentrated, you know, in the size of the head of a pen or something, how did it ever expand? You would think that would be, and expand, inflate for what reason? Where gravity works in reverse and without cause. Yeah, I mean, it just goes on, and you talk about the biochemical evolution of life, but even the stellar. I mean, how do if you take a can of hairspray or whatever and start spraying it around wherever you want, does that gas coagulate and come together, or does it disperse? Well, you're in the vacuum of space, you're throwing gas together. How is that gas supposed to come together? I mean, there's all kinds of singular or odd things that the other side, you know, has, you know, what they think are good explanations for, or they will tell me that, well, we're working on that. You know, we don't know. We really don't know, but we're confident we will figure that one out.
We're confident there's no God, and we'll figure it out. We're humans, and we're what's their word? We're evolving. Well, no, we're devolving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, some of these people are so smart. I mean, there really are some super intelligent people, but you know, the Bible talks about there are people that will become ever learning, but never come to a knowledge of the truth. And I think we have folks like that today. But then you've got people like John Lennox, retired mathematician from Cambridge or Oxford or whatever. His videos are great. Their debates are worth watching. He's got a John Lennox website. There's creation.com is a great website for Christians to go to. Answers in Gen. I mean, there's a lot of really good resources that people can use to maybe learn a few things, so that when they're in conversation with somebody, you know, that they don't feel put upon and beat up, because the other side loves, and I've been the brunt of this a lot of times, they want to get loud, they want to get in your face, they want to call you names. And, you know, the first 20 or 30 times that happens, I mean, that's kind of intimidating to people, right? You know, and your reaction is you want to stir up and get mad. It's like, look, they're lost. Some of these folks are, you know, on their way to a Christless eternity. So how can I, you know, respond in a way that is not going to push them further, you know?
Well, Joe, we've got to cut it off for tonight. We cannot wait to get you back on sometime in the near future. But here's what two things I want to end on. One is Jesus said, I have to go away. But if I go away, I will pray the Father to send you a helper, meaning the Holy Spirit. And remember what he said about the Holy Spirit. He said the Holy Spirit will teach you all truth. All truth. You will learn the truth if you're saved, because the Holy Spirit will teach it to you. Okay, so that's number one. And number two, I'm like you. I agree. There's so many resources out there. I remember so many years we'd be sitting there watching nature on PBS. We'd be watching National Geographic Channel. We'd be watching Animal Planet, and so many things that the narrator, you're watching the videos, you're watching the documentaries, and the narrator is literally handing you designed creation, but they won't call it that. And, they would throw words out there, evolved. And I'd just look over and I'd say, that's not evolution. That is evidence right there of how complex God's created beings really are. And so that's where I started getting converted, let's say. And to end this, here's what I'm going to say. I challenge people in our Bible study. We have one every Sunday night. I challenge people in our Bible study. Do you believe your Bible or not? Do you want to believe part of your Bible and throw part of it away? Do you have the right to believe or claim to believe part of it and throw the rest of it away that you don't agree with or don't can't rationalize what the secular world has told you about it? And my challenge to them is, if you're going to believe part of it, you got to believe all of it. Otherwise, why believe Jesus was the Son of God? Why believe, we're in need of a Savior? Why believe in the fall of man? And it all starts with Genesis chapters 1 through 11. That's the foundation. So I'm going to end it there, Joe. What you got to say?
Well, I agree. There's so much things we can discuss. You were talking about the complexity of the genetic code. I mean, life is not ordered. Life is complex, and randomness, you really cannot explain these complex informational systems interacting with other complex informational systems by just random processes. So there's a lot of information there that we can get into future days. So there's some other young Earth evidence. There's a few more that we can go through at a future time.
Oh, there's a ton more.
Yeah. So I mean, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and hopefully maybe somebody had a interest or a question answered, or at least maybe motivated to go look for an answer. So
Joe, I've got about 40 something tabs over here of Google opened up. I've Googled just about every other word you said. So believe me, I have learned a lot tonight.
Okay.
You are a pool of information and knowledge, and it's always a pleasure to sit around and listen to you and Keith talk. I used to, back in the office with you guys back in the day, anytime you'd stop by, thoroughly enjoyed listening to the conversations y'all would have, and now we're doing it for fun. So
yeah, really.
Hopefully we get to bring you back for a part 2, 3, 4. We'd love, and
we get to drill down to some really uncontrovertible evidence of and that's what I find, that Joe, when you ask people about, did you ever hear about so and so? Have you ever seen so and so? Well, no, it's because you're not supposed to know, because that could call into question evolution. Evolution is the new holy religion, and so that's why. So, Joe, every little bit of this that we can do to expose people, don't believe it because I say it. Have a Berean spirit. Acts 17. Have a Berean spirit.
That's right.
Be open. Most people quote the second part, but the first part's just as important, and that is listen with an open mind. That is part of that same verse when it talks about the Bereans went home and searched the scriptures to see if what Paul had been teaching them was true. Well, that passage, the first part of it says they were listening with an open mind. And so that's all we say is, be ready to receive, because it's out there. Just because it's been hidden from you for so long, hey, we're fixing to open your eyes. That's my thing. Joe, it's been great. Thank you for giving us your time. And we definitely want you on sometime in the future. So
okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me, guys. Good to see you.
For any of the listeners at home, just to give Joe a quick plug, he's an architect. He graduated here in Lubbock from Texas Tech University. If you need architectural services, how many states are you licensed in, Joe?
I'm down from 10 to 4, so 4 is plenty to keep up with.
He's not looking for work, but I'm sure he could take a look at it. But Joe, thanks again for being on with us. For the followers at home, please be sure to like our live here. Give us a follow on our pages: TikTok, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook. Be sure to share with your friends and family. It's definitely something when Joe comes back on, we want to have everybody on as much as possible and share Joe's knowledge and expertise in this subject. And thanks again, Joe. Really appreciated having you on, man. Can't wait to do it again.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm an amateur, so,
All right.
You got it down, buddy. You got it down. Thank you so much, Joe. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, guys.